Barnes & Noble Union Square, please give a warm welcome for #1 New York Times bestselling author Jeannette Walls and poured-over producer and host Miwa Messer.
Well, hello, New York, and hello, those of you who are joining us virtually. We are also taping for the Poured Over podcast, so I just want to remind you that we are actually videotaping and we're audio taping, and we're doing all sorts of great stuff. It is my great good fortune to be on a stage with Jeannette Walls. And also, this is going to be a really fun conversation. If you gave us a question when you registered on Eventbrite, I have those questions. If you gave us an index card and put questions on it, I have those too. So we will get to them, I promise. I don't actually hold questions until the end of the show. I like to work them in as we go because it's way more interesting for all of us. I will say some of you were reading my mind, so just be prepared. There's a little bit of overlap between you guys and me. But more importantly, Jeannette, I'm so excited to see you. Hang the Moon is our new B&N Book Club selection for April.
Thank you.
It is very, very good. It is on sale today. We are going spoiler-free in this conversation because I had all of the pleasure reading this, and I am not going to ruin it for you. So, just want to warn you, if you do want to join the book club discussion, that's May 2nd. There are details on bn.com. We will be spoiling everything to the rooftops and back. But tonight, we're going to talk about some different stuff. So this is where I get to ask you how you found your voice.
It took a while.
Yeah.
It took a while. I'm embarrassed to admit, but I will, that there were 17 versions of this book.
Yeah,
and,
I heard that.
Yeah. It wasn't until I went into first person present that it kind of clicked for me.
Right.
I like writing about scrappy, tough girls. And so you kind of write what you know, right?
Yeah.
So it was also very important for me to be authentic and to try to get my head inside somebody who lived 100 years ago was a challenge. I think that often we read historical books and they sound very contemporary or they sound very stilted.
Yieldy-timey languagey.
Yeah. And I really wanted to avoid that.
Right.
And there was a lot of slang from the era that I tried out, and I felt it took the reader out of the moment. I just wanted to be kind of timeless. I didn't want to be contemporary or old-fashioned. So it took a while, but as soon as I found her, with the great help of my fabulous editor, Nan Graham, who is here, really the book would not have happened without her, because I think, you get so close to this stuff, you have no idea whether it's any good or not. And I'm a fast writer, but I'm sloppy. And I write down whatever comes into my head and I look at it, this is just awful. So I just have to keep on rewriting and rewriting.
Okay, but where do the short chapters come in? Because you fly through this book. I mean, a lot happens.
Yeah.
A lot of good stuff, a lot of bad stuff. A lot happens. But your chapters are maybe 3 to 5 pages. I mean, there were, 50-something chapters in this book?
Yeah, I have a short attention span.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Because it's very cinematic.
Yes, thank you. I've been told that. Once I put it in first person, present, and this will sound so flaky, but I could actually kind of see it. I hope this doesn't sound like I'm name dropping, but sitting on the set of the movie of Making the Glass Castle,
right? It
was very informative for me about character.
Yep.
The actors there were so passionate about authenticity, about understanding these crazy people who are my family members. And they would ask such brilliant and straightforward questions about, what did your dad, Woody Harrelson, what did your dad do with his hands when he talked to you? That kind of thing. And one time I was on a panel with Lisa DeGenoa, and somebody asked her, who wrote Still Alice, somebody asked her, what was the best fiction writing advice anybody ever gave you? And she said, take an acting class. At the time I thought it was stupid. I was like, what does that have to do with anything? But then when I went full-fledged into fiction, which in a way, Hang the Moon is my first fully fictional book. Right. Even though a lot of it is based on historical events, but I get it now. I get it because you have to understand these people you're writing about. You have to get inside your head. So watching, I was sitting down with Brie Larson, who played me in The Glass Castle, and she's kind of subdued and low-key. But we were talking for about a half an hour, and she gets kind of loud and like kind of gesturing and weird with this loud, weird laugh. And then I realized, oh, she's doing me. You know, she completely transformed herself. And my jaw just dropped. Like, how did she do that?
Right.
And I think fiction writing is an act of empathy, and it's putting yourself inside somebody else's shoes and inside their mind. And what would this person do in these circumstances? And so that's what I was trying to do. And again, please forgive me if I sounded all la-di-da, but it was just trying to understand this woman who lived 100 years ago. What would she do in these situations? And trying to put yourself into that world.
Lived 100 years ago under pretty remarkable circumstances, though. And you currently live in a corner of Virginia that is pretty close to where this book is set. Would you set that up for us and let us know what that landscape looks like? Because I think that's a really important part of Hang the Moon.
Yeah, I live in Orange, Virginia, which it's right at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. So it's you know, there's the plateau on one side and the mountains on the other. And Virginia is the flat parts were settled by the Blue Bloods, and then the Scots-Irish went to the mountains. So it's very kind of divided sociologically. But in addition to that, the further west you get, the kind of wilder it gets. I love where I live, but it's very contradictory place. It's a lot of social divide. It's a constant inspiration for writing. Let's just say I stole a lot for this book. I just what was going on around me in these small towns, they all have the big man in town who controls everything.
Right.
And that was the sort of thing that I put into this book.
I get stealing a little bit of that kind of thing, but also the way you write about isolation and the dangers of isolation and sort of exile within a community. I mean, Sallie Kincaid has a moment where she's kicked out of her family. Her dad makes he makes a decision that works for him and works for the new wife, and oh, there's a kid, right? So kid gets sent into exile with her aunt in the mountains.
Right. You know, this book is like, there's a lot of moonshining, there's a lot of shooting and driving around fast, but at its heart, it's about family. It's about how we fit into family and how we define ourselves and how other people define us. Sallie was a tomboy, and she adored her hard-drinking, bossy, overbearing father and wanted to be just like him. And then she got kicked out and brought back into the family right before she turned 18 and believed in the family mythology that being a Kincaid meant you were special and different. And in some ways that helped her get through some tough times. In another way, it blinded her to the things going on, the dilemmas that other people experienced.
Right. So here we are. You've had a memoir that sat on top of the bestseller list for 461 weeks. Yeah, that's pretty much the only response you can have. You wrote a novel ostensibly about your grandmother, and let's call it the Wild West, because, I mean, come on, half-broke horses, great story. And then we go to California in the 70s, and we've got a couple of little girls and a mom who may or may not feel slightly familiar. And now here we are with Sallie Kincaid in 1920s Virginia, and lots of stuff happens. But I want to talk about giving voice to women, because you're taking these women who don't necessarily get to tell their stories, right? If we look at the history books, yeah, we've got Laura Ingalls, digging the dirt house and all that. I was desperate for a sod house when I was a child, and my parents were not going to let me do it.
You too.
Oh, totally. And my mother was like, no, what are you doing? Get out of the dirt. I'm like, but we don't tell these stories. We don't let women and girls tell the pieces in between, right?
Right.
And here you are across all of your books, whether memoir or fiction, this is what you're doing. Do you feel a responsibility to your audience when you're doing this, or do you just really want to tell the story?
I don't.
No?
I don't feel responsibility. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm not that I'm not that conscientious. I just write what interests me, and you write what you know. I mean, people say you write about strong women. I'm like, yeah, that's the only kind of. I like stories about tough people during tough times.
Right.
I like stories about survival. How do you get through these really? I'm not so good with existential angst. That's not my forte.
Right.
It's more just sort of like fighting for your life, and it fascinates me, and I think, people have said, gosh, you're so strong and you're so tough. We're all stronger and tougher than we realize.
Right.
It's just that some of us are lucky enough to have been tested and know how tough we are. And I think that Sallie's being exiled from her family and then coming back, and she does okay when she comes back. She's not perfect. She's far from perfect. But I think her being exiled, she succeeds not in spite of the difficulties she went through, but because of them. I think it taught her toughness and humility on some level. Maybe not quite enough humility, but it taught her to understand that the people on the other side of the tracks have a tough time as well. So I firmly believe that everything in life is both a blessing and a curse, and you can turn over the worst thing in the world and find something wonderful about it. Right. And you can feel sorry for yourself about all these awful things that happen to you, or you put a harness on your demons and put them to work for you. And that's kind of my philosophy in life. It's like, look, people have said that I could feel sorry for myself or angry with my parents because of whatever. What good would that do? I think I'm the luckiest person in the world. I really do. I mean, my parents didn't give me everything, but they gave me a great copy.
Lucky readers. Lucky readers. Part of why I want to bring back this idea of women's stories, right? And telling women's stories, which, we still don't always get right. Even now, I mean, your books are all playing with this idea of an American mythology, right? The American dream. Yes. Where we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to aspire to. This idea of, in some ways, respectability. I mean, that's all over the new book, Hang the Moon. I mean, who's respectable, who's not? Who decides who's respectable? Yes. Ew. Yes. It makes for great reading, but ew. Yeah. So let's talk about blowing up the American dream for a second.
Yeah. I mean, the book was set 100 years ago, and I was, and I spent a lot of time reading newspapers from that period. Right. I thought I was going to fall completely in love with the 1920s and want to go back there and as bad as things are, they've gotten better. Okay. Yeah. And there was just so much attention to this notion of respectability and others, the other people. And one of the things, Prohibition is very much at the center of this book. And Prohibition was kind of a nativist movement. It was a women's movement as well. But it was people saying, family is important. Let's get back to the good times like it used to be. There was some pressure, the idea of the crazy Germans coming over with their beer and the crazy Italians coming over with all their wine. Let's make America great like it used to be. Sound familiar? It was a time of incredible pressure and divisiveness. And with women, they had taken on men's jobs during the First World War, and then they had to let go of those jobs once the men came back. So it's very much a story about what role do we play in society and in our own lives. So I wanted Sallie to be figuring out the same, Sallie's going through that same struggle against the backdrop of a country that is trying to figure out where it's going. And it was a very dark time in so many ways. It was so racist. It was so misogynistic in so many ways. And it was just accepted that that was the way. As crazy as times are right now with the internet and everything, I think it's hard to imagine 100 years ago when electricity and automobiles were becoming available to people for the first time, for the masses, and just the incredible anxiety and nervousness about this new technology. I read an obituary by a man who liked to brag that he had not set foot ever in a train or a streetcar or an automobile. These things were a threat to the American way of life, to some people. And at the same time, America was urbanizing. So there was this astonishing pressure. What kind of country are we going to be? How do we define ourselves? What does it mean to be an American? And that's kind of what Prohibition was on some level. There was also a genuine belief that if they could outlaw liquor, that crime would disappear. It was the articles and the sermons of the time. It's fascinating to read them because people actually believe this. We can eliminate liquor. We will eliminate crime. We can close the jails. We'll use this money to educate people. It was this utopian ideal. It was a complete and utter disaster. A crime wave like we'd never seen before. The price of liquor went up and the quality went down, and drinking actually increased. So it was, it was a well-intended law in a way, but it was also the law of unintended consequences. What happens when you try to control people's behavior? And of course, laws are supposed to control people's behavior, but what happens when you try to take people's choices away from them.
You know, this idea that we can make our own fortunes and that we can make our own way and that we can make our own worlds. That is so much part of this American mythology. It's also part of your family's mythology. If we look at your grandmother, I mean, certainly if we look at your parents, but let's go back to your grandmother for a second. Let's go back to Lily and half-broke horses for a second. I mean, talk about making your own world. 15, she gets on the back of a horse and says, I'm going to go teach because I don't have an option. I mean, this is like really deep-seated American mythology. It's the creation of the West. It's making yourself. It's making a life. And, you know, yes, she gets married and does a little bootlegging and does a little breaking of horses and all of this good stuff. But she's never quite what we might think of as a traditional grandmotherly type, right? She always gets to keep herself. She gets to keep herself.
Oh, yeah.
Which Sallie does to a certain extent. There are other women in Hang the Moon who do not get to keep themselves.
No.
But I'm dancing around this whole idea of mythology, whether it's your family's mythology or our country's mythology, because you brought in an element of story that I was pleasantly surprised by, but I have to ask, and this really isn't a spoiler because I promise you, a bunch of you are going to figure it out as soon as you start reading, because I was like, wait a minute, what? Henry Tudor and some of his family members may be a little bit of background to this book. Can we talk about this for a second?
Yes. I have long been fascinated by the story of Elizabeth I. My parents would get into screaming arguments about Elizabeth. My mother hated her, and my father defended her. My older sister was born on her birthday and over-identified with her. Mm-hmm. But I've always found it a really fascinating story of this woman who she was expected to go nowhere. She was expected to be nothing. And by some bizarre set of circumstances, she ended up heading the family business, which happened to be running the country, and did a fabulous job. So I was fascinated by that. And I was reading a biography of her, and I was thinking, this is so white trash, you know, because they're all marrying cousins and killing each other and doing all these tricks. And I was like, why don't you take this story, which a lot of Americans don't. Their parents didn't fight. Not everybody's parents fought over Elizabeth. So a lot of people aren't familiar with this story, which shocks me. But it's this great story of survival against the odds of being underestimated and refusing to be pigeonholed. So I thought, why don't you take this basic nuts and bolts of this story and put it in somewhat modern America? And it was my husband who suggested Prohibition, because you need some place where people can kill each other with random. So I hesitate to mention the background because sometimes I see people's eyes glazing over when they hear Tudors, like, oh no, it's a history lesson. But I love history. I think, you know, he who ignores history is doomed to repeat it. But beyond that, I've heard this expression, I love it, has been attributed to Mark Twain, but he didn't say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. We keep on going through we have to keep on learning these same lessons about identity and all that. I love the story of this woman who survives and prospers against all odds, but at a great price. That being said, this is not a retelling of Elizabeth I. It's not. No. This is also the reason that it took 17 drafts, because a very early version was. A couple of early versions where it's sort of like, okay, West Virginia is Scotland, okay, you know, where I was just matching up one against one. And Sallie had to become her own person. It's one thing to be arrogant and high-handed if you're the monarch of England. It's another to be arrogant and high-handed if you're a bootlegger. So I had to make her own person. I'm fascinated by this journey of this woman who made it against all odds and the price she paid. So that's kind of the basic structure of it.
We've got all of these moving parts. You know, these women and their voices and the decisions they make, and this community that may or may not be prepared for the decisions these women are making.
Yes.
And I'm talking across all of the books, mind you. Like, I really, not just Hang them. And yes, we are sort of focusing on this, but if you've read all of the books, you know exactly what I'm doing right here. I see heads nodding in the back. You're working with these incredibly complicated characters. And in some cases, you're working off of inspiration from whatever is in front of you, family stories, what have you. But when do you know that you've found the emotional truth of what you're trying to do? Because it's not the same as just being able to tell the story and hit the points and hit the beats, right? Yeah. When do you know you have the thing? I mean, in this case, it took you 17 drafts, but...
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And especially when you're taking things from real history, which I did. A lot of these characters are based on people who were around during Prohibition. You're putting all these pieces together, some from inspiration, some that are out there. And sometimes you end up with this like Frankenstein-looking creature where the legs are too long and it just doesn't fit. And you read it and like, this just is kind of bad, So I don't know. And that's why I have a fabulous editor. And she tells me, okay, you got it. But there is a point that sometimes you're like, I think this works. I think this feels true. This sounds true.
Right. Okay. You've described yourself in the past, though, as being pathologically independent. And does that change now? I mean, you've worked with Nan on 4 books now.
Yeah.
I mean, your husband, you've thanked him for millions of story points in different places. And it sounds like you don't get to be pathologically independent anymore when you're creating these worlds.
My husband has this good line about writing. He said that you have to have faith in yourself and question yourself at the same time. It's this funny balance. But I guess that's true in all of life, isn't it? You have to have faith, but you have to question yourself. And you have to constantly say, is this any good? And you have to be able to criticize yourself or take other people's criticism. You have to. I don't want compliments when I'm writing. I want somebody to tell me this doesn't work. I don't want to be embarrassed because, you can be. I mean, you put your stuff out there. I'd rather have somebody say, go back, do it again.
Everyone needs an editor.
Everyone needs an editor.
Even when it's just tiny bits of copy, everyone needs an editor.
Yes.
You have also talked about in the past feeling more secure writing nonfiction because everything was sort of laid out in the details, right? The truth is in the details. And yet here you are, the last 3 books. You get further and further away from, I mean, I know Half Broke Horses was, what did we call it?
A true life novel.
True life novel, thank you.
Yeah.
Which I had never heard before. And I understand exactly what that subtitle means, but are you finally at a point where you don't necessarily need to lean on the details of a thing to be able to find the truth of what you're trying to do?
I thought I would never write fiction.
Okay.
I thought I would, and for years I said about myself and believed I do not make things up. I have no imagination. Half Broke Horses was as close to the truth as I could get it.
Okay.
My mother told me about her mother, and I have no idea how much of it is true, so I called it fiction. But in addition to that, I wrote it first person, but it was as close as I could get it. Silver Star is cobbled together from things I knew. I think it was for Silver Star, and I kept on saying, I don't make things up. I was on a book tour, kind of like this, and I said, I have no imagination. I don't make things up. And a gentleman in the front row, he raised his hand and very gently told me, he said, I think you have a fabulous imagination. You're just afraid of your own creativity. And it just about knocked my socks off because I think he's right. He was onto something. And I thought about it a whole lot because both of my parents had a relationship of convenience with the truth. And my father had a bunch of characters in his head that he would trot out whenever he needed. And my mother she was just out there. I mean, she was kind of a liar, but she just made things up all the time. Right. And I think I sought out the truth. The truth will set you free. It was the answers were in the truth. It was there. It was only thanks to that gentleman that I realized I think I can go a little bit further in this direction. And I'd been thinking about this story for a while and thought I'd give it a shake. And most of the incidents in Hang the Moon are inspired by true life events that happened during Prohibition. Right. Originally, I clung to it too tight. And my fabulous editor, Nan Graham, had to pull my long, bony fingers off the facts and said, you have to make this your own. Make these people your own. Right. And that was quite a transition for me. But she was absolutely right. Once I kind of just relaxed and tried to see things as this fictional character who I'd created, I was able to make things up, which is kind of like lying, but it's not.
Oh, it's not. Come on.
But it's not.
You're just telling a story.
So when I was trying to cram it too hard to take these facts and cram it into this fictional book, it wasn't working. And I had to take out pieces of what really happened and make it my own. And it was a little shocking for me that you can do that and not be struck by lightning. But I did kind of get there. And I was like, oh, this is what they call fiction. Now, okay, I get it. And it's kind of scary because you can go in any direction. It's like navigating in the ocean. You can go there, you can go there, you can go there. So you don't have the facts to guide you. And that's where your whole question about like, well, I mean, if it really happened, then I don't have to worry about, could this happen? But when you're writing fiction, you have to say, is this believable? Does this feel true? Does this feel right? Does this feel true to this character? Would they do this?
I'm going to grab a question from the audience for a second. Having written fiction and nonfiction, which is easier to express? Your own voice or the voice of a fictional character? And you've sort of answered it, but not entirely, which is why I'm asking the question.
I find nonfiction easier, but fiction more potentially powerful because you can manipulate it and move it around a little. But I do feel that most fiction, at least the kind of fiction I'm drawn to, is deeply rooted in truth, in what's out there.
Are you reading for character first or are you reading for language first?
Interesting. Character.
Yeah.
Character, okay. I think.
Because that's what it feels like from reading you.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you could argue that voice is the thing that swings the hardest out of each of your books. Like, there's a voice, there's a distinct voice to each of the books. But at the same time, I'm kind of like, well, is voice its own character?
That's interesting. I think that, if you don't have the voice, it's just not going to work, period. Right. But the characters, they have to feel real. You just have to kind of know these people. Those are kind of the building blocks. Then the language, I mean, it can be really bad at first, and you just keep on going through it over and over again and make it feel. I also read all of my books aloud once I finish them.
Yeah, okay. I was wondering about that because they fly. I mean, just the narrative thrust of all of your books, it's wild how quickly you can turn the pages. And I don't mean in sort of the psychological thriller sense of I need to know who did it, but it is kind of like, wait a minute, I didn't even realize I'd gone that far quickly.
Thank you. I try to make it kind of conversational. I'm not interested in, I mean, God bless those writers who do these long, complicated sentences. That's not me. When
it comes to craft, though, and we've had multiple questions from both the online audience and Eventbrite and all of that. When it comes to craft, do you have sort of a specific discipline that keeps you in your seat and writing, as it were?
Or, okay. I'm obsessive. I'm kind of nutty. I'm just kind of like, I want to get back to the computer as soon as I can. It's the first thing I think about every morning and the last thing I think about at night. I want to get to these people and work this darn thing out. I mean, this book took me, depending on when you want to say I started, I was 8 years.
Right.
But I just wanted to get Sallie's story out. I grew to really like Sallie.
She's great.
Well, she's kind of flawed. She's not perfect, but I really grew to care about her and just wanted her to. Now I'm talking like a crazy person about this person who I made up, but I cared about her and her ridiculous story and her flaws and her blinders and how she, she's not a bad person, but she does some bad things and makes some really bad decisions. But it was a tough time. And, and what would you do to resolve this stupid story and tell it and get it out there and get it done? But I sit down in the morning and, like I said, I'm a fast but sloppy reader. And then you go through it again and go through it again and just sort of like, does this work? Does this work?
I mean, I read somewhere that at one point you and your husband were acting out problem points in the book because it was the only way to figure out what had gone wrong.
If somebody's dialogue, especially Sallie's, didn't feel right, my husband would play the other character and I'd be Sallie. And he'd say, just say what comes to mind. Don't think it out. So he'd play the Duke and like, well, I'm going to send you to work. I don't want to. And so I just write that down. The only problem with that is that sometimes I kept on using these mid-century curse words. And so I'd have to take those out. I found this great resource. It's Green's Dictionary of Slang. And I realized that all of my curse words come from it's post-GI curse words. Can I say a curse word?
You can totally do whatever you want.
Dumb ass. It's a mid-century curse word. And cojones, that was Hemingway around, I think it was 1937. So a lot of this slang, much of slang came around during the 1920s. And I was really trying hard to have this book in casual language. The slang from the period made it sound like kind of, 23 skidoo, but that's not going to happen. That's not going to work. So Sallie was a real potty mouth originally, but I ended up taking out most of the curse words. And at first it just broke my heart to lose those, but it actually felt more authentic afterwards. Deadwood notwithstanding, I think people didn't curse as much.
Deadwood is its own special thing. And actually, that came up in a different interview I did last week. I don't know what's in the air with Deadwood right now, but something's going on. No, I think it's true, though. And I do, the danger with historical fiction is, I was sort of making fun of it at the top of the show, but this ye olde timey languagey thing, and it just rips you right out of the story and your eyes kind of cross. And it's just not what I want as a reader.
Ditto. And similarly with dialect, I made the decision not to put stuff in dialect because Sallie, this story takes place in 1919, 1920, around there. She didn't sound funny to herself in its first person present. So she's not like, I said to them, that being said, when I read the contemporary newspapers, they would quote mountain people in dialect.
Oh, wow.
And when and African-American people, they would quote in dialect. So to me, quoting dialect is very often a tool of otherness. This is how they sound. You never hear upper class people, like, let's have some tea. I mean, they talk, they sound funny too, but they never quoted it. So I made that decision. And I also flicked a couple of times at her thinking that other people sound funny, because you got to remember at this time, people didn't know what other people sounded like, because you were usually confined to your own county. At least people like Sallie were. Radio wasn't around yet. So, and the First World War just happened and people came back. It was so fascinating reading these letters from the period about, like, I met somebody who had an Italian accent, and it was just so exotic to them to hear somebody with a different accent, because people weren't going in and out of these communities. It was just so insular. And this was the period in history when it stopped being that insular. Right. And that's why it was so scary, and why people who looked different and sounded different were exotic and threatening and kind of scary.
I think part of the appeal, too, of historical fiction is we get to step back and say, well, that wouldn't have been me. And sometimes we're not right when we say that, but we say it anyway. Yeah. And that is always interesting to me, people's responses where it's like, well, I would have done it differently. And I'm thinking, not really. If you get kicked out of your family, kicked off the farm, kicked out of your community, it's not like you could open a bank account and just move.
That's that's an interesting point, because I wanted to make Sallie sympathetic and kind, but she can't be woke. She can't, and she also can't sound like she just came from some sort of a therapy meeting. I mean, she's a product of her time, and she has to have some of that baggage and some of that obliviousness.
Yeah, shame is not a concept that your characters are clued in on, but wow, do they carry a lot of it. There's a lot of it. But I mean, I think that's part of the beauty of stepping into a novel like this, Hang the Moon, and just being able to say, hey, wait a minute, who are these people? What is this world? I mean, Appalachia is not a place I've spent a lot of time in. Virginia, I've driven through Virginia. I've done the whole DC thing, but DC, Virginia is different. No, that's different. Very, very different.
No, Northern Virginia is not Virginia.
And that's exactly it. It's not. Virginia, and there are pockets. Of place now that are still very much like it's not quite the 1920s, but
but it's real close.
It's wild.
And that's one of the reasons that I sort of felt qualified to write it, even though I mean it is set 100 years ago, but I think that I'm more qualified than many people, because I grew up largely without indoor plumbing and without electricity, so I kind of know that world. But also because there are people who are kind of stuck in time. They say you win a battle, you forget it pretty quickly. You lose a battle, you never forget. And these are people who never forget. And they're very steeped in their own history. So it's very close. That being said, I did have to put myself back somewhat. What was it like to go through all of this? And the scariness, the threat and the fear of this changing world. I mean, this is the jazz era, and everybody's sitting around reading Gatsby and doing the Charleston. And I thought I'd kind of fall in love with the period. But you read the newspapers, and the most popular movie at the time was Birth of a Nation, which was glorifying the Ku Klux Klan. And because I'm a research nerd, I watched that thing, okay? And my eyes are still burned, got holes burned in it. And it was like, wow, wow. Anybody who wants to get nostalgic, do a little research, okay? Because you go back and you look at these times. It was, it was very...
Lindbergh made some nasty speeches.
He did.
I mean, I get it. You flew a plane, but at the same time, wow, the things that came out of his mouth.
And a lot of the heroes of that period were that way. And a very mixed bag. So I just think it's very important to remember, simpler, better times, not really. And especially for women. And, the automobile was so monumental in changing people's lives. I think more for women than for men. Men could hop on a horse and go somewhere. For women, especially a lady, you had to get in a carriage, and carriages were very expensive. You hook up the wagon. It was not a one-person job, and going into town took all day. It was an all-day thing. And washing the clothes, forget it. Even women of not much means hired somebody to wash the clothes. So running the household, it was hard, and it was dirty, and it was strenuous. Technology changed so much of that. And people were really kind of threatened about, well, where are women going in the world? And that's, Sallie, I mean, she was not woke. She would have never called herself a feminist, but she was somebody who just didn't like the role that was assigned to her.
And also, we didn't get to wear pants. We didn't have pockets.
No. No, I'm convinced that women cut their hair short because of cars, because most of the automobiles were open, and you wore one of those whoop-de-doo pompadours in an open car. The automobile was huge, and I believe pants and the more reasonable dresses, because those hoop scoots would have never fit into the cars. It was a time that technology was really redefining people's lives. Some of the women were really clinging to the old roles. In fact, Prohibition was largely a woman's movement.
Oh, I do know that.
Yeah.
There's a lot that people are going to get to play with in Hang the Moon, but you're about to be on the road for 4 to 6 weeks. It was long. We were talking about this in the green room a second ago. But what have you learned from your readers? I mean, you've been doing this book thing since 2005.
Yeah. Readers are a lot smarter than I am. One time somebody asked me, why didn't your mother sell that land? Y'all could have had a normal life. And I said, I don't know. And I've asked my mom. I can't get a straight answer. A woman in the audience raises her hand. She said, I know. I said, how do you know? She said, my book club discussed it. So, and she had a really good answer too. So I've never been to therapy. I just hang out with book club people. They're really smart, So readers have challenged me, like the gentleman who said, and people will push me on things. I love talking to them, but the lesson I have to keep on learning from readers, and I'll be signing books, and there'll be some decked out woman, and she's all Neiman Marcus'd out or something like that. And I'm thinking, and she'll come over and she'll say, girlfriend, you and I could be sisters. My daddy, my mom was a cocktail waitress, and my daddy was a truck driver, got in the car one day and drove away. And it's a lesson I keep on having to learn. Do not judge people, and they tell me their stories. This young African-American woman I was in, she said, Ms. Walls, I'm going to be honest with you. When your book was assigned, she said, I didn't want to read about no West Virginia hillbilly. She said, same line, but girlfriend, you and I could be sisters. And that's what I love about storytelling is I think that honesty is contagious. And when you start telling your stories, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it encourages other people to tell their stories. A lot of us walk around in armor like I was, and, it protects us, but it also isolates you. And once you take that armor off, I was unprepared for the kindness and the goodness of people. I was unprepared to be loved and understood. And I think that they've shocked me with their compassion. And that's why I love storytelling.
Has that been the biggest reward for you? Writing?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, far and away.
I mean, because back in the day, you did the gossip thing before the gossip thing became, Instagram.
Yeah, I was the bonehead who sticks microphones into people's celebrities' faces and asks them who designs their outfits. And I thought, how does it, can't get any better than this, right? But, I believe the truth will set you free, but the truth is complicated.
Yeah. And I think we do have to leave space. I mean, you've said this before in other interviews, that there are people who love your mom and there are people who cannot get away from your mother fast enough. I mean, that is, and it's wild to me that we have these responses, to people we'll never meet. Or people who are fictional characters. I mean, I frequently talk about I'm a bookseller. I talk about fictional characters like they're sitting next to me. It's not weird. It's my job. It's what I do. But the idea that we can actually change the world one story at a time.
I completely believe that. I think, I've just been so fortunate that people read The Glass Castle in schools.
Right.
It was banned in a Dallas suburb. One parent objected to it. And the other parents and the school teachers, and God bless them, the students got together. This was a very well-to-do suburb, and they said, we need to read stories like this. Yeah. And they invited me to come talk. And another author warned me, said, oh, those kids are brats. They're horrible. You're going to hate it. We had the most amazing time. And then here's the PS that's so beautiful. A young student hung back and said, I want to thank you for that story because I had a similar situation and your story gave me the courage to tell about my parents, what was going on. And so we poor folk have not cornered the market on weird parents. It's this storytelling that is so magical. And I understand why people want to like protect their kids and keep them away from all the bad books out there. But the truth is, the way to protect kids, in my opinion, is not to isolate them or insulate them, but to give them the tools and the intelligence and the storytelling, and to find the strength within themselves to know that they can deal with these things and discuss these things in the safety of their classrooms and in their houses. And I just think that the whole process of storytelling, it brings us so much closer together. We all look different. We come from different parts of the world, but beyond the appearances, we all want the same thing. We want respect and security and to be loved. And that's what storytelling does, is it connects the similarities that we have.
Do you feel like you've finally been heard?
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, a long time ago.
Okay.
Oh, no,
I mean,
no.
35 languages for Glass Castle. That's not nothing.
No. I am so lucky. And like I said, sometimes readers hear me better than I hear myself. They will challenge me and say, oh, you said this, but I'm not sure I agree with you on that. And I love that. I love that. I love being wrong because that's how you learn. You like, oh, you're right about that. I was being too glib or whatever. So yeah, I'm heard and then some. I mean, kids write papers on my book. They send me, somebody asked me, is this a dream come true for you? I would have to be a crazy person to dream this. I would have to be nuts.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, it's so far exceeds anything I expected from a raggedy little story. No.
Do you know what the next thing is yet?
No.
Okay.
No. I'm obsessive, and I'm only good at one thing at a time, I realize.
That's not unreasonable. I mean, multitasking really is overrated.
I think it is.
Overrated,
I don't know if it's overrated. I can't do it. I can't think about two things at a time.
It's just I've finished Hang the Moon and I need another Jeannette Walls. It's pure self-interest. That's straight up. Anyway, Jeannette Walls, thank you so much for joining us. Hang the Moon is out now. It's the April Barnes & Noble Book Club pick. And join us on May 2nd online. You can dial in. I think it's 3 p.m. Eastern. And then we'll do all of the dirt. We will get all of the dirt for it. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.